You're listening to or watching Strangers in Space, and for the next, well, I don't know. This is a bit timey-wimey, isn't it? So I say 60 minutes. I've no idea how long it's going to be. But the weird thing is, if you're listening to it or watching it, you know exactly how long it's going to be. So I'll just say X, and you can fill in the blank for yourself. You're listening to or watching Strangers in Space, and for the next X minutes, we're going to be talking about War for the Sontarans. In fact, War of the Sontarans, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Simon.
That was a slick intro.
It was. Well, you know me. Got to get it right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's plenty of orders of business before we get stuck in. So I'm not going to do the did you like it straight away yet. I'm going to do 5 minutes on AIs and ratings and things. Just because why not? Let's catch up with it. Because we talked about it a little bit last time. And I don't think we'll talk about it every week. But I think it's worth just mentioning a couple of things before we get stuck in. Because the AI for the first week was 76. The AI for this second episode has gone up to 77, which is quite unusual. I mean, I think overall the appreciation for the episode perhaps was better among fans. But the AI, of course, is not among fans. It's among a general audience. And I don't know whether the general audience would necessarily have found the episode particularly better. And let's face it, 76 against 77 is the difference between 7.6 out of 10 and 7.7 out of 10. So it's barely a noticeable difference at all, really. But the other thing is the on the night audience share for the first episode was 26.9%. In other words, out of everybody sitting in front of a television set last Sunday night, or the Sunday before last, 26.9% of them who were watching live television were tuned in to Doctor Who. This week, that went down to 23.4%. So that's a fraction less of the audience share. And actually, both of those audience shares are bigger than Doctor Who has been getting for quite some time. So Doctor Who has been generally tending to hover around the 21-22% mark on the audience share. So Doctor Who's audience share is expanding even as television audiences dwindle. The point I'm getting to is this. The more people who are watching live, the bigger the chance that a lot of those people are kind of watching telly for the sake of having the telly on, and they're probably less engaged with what they're watching than people who watch on catch up. Because you'll know as well as I do, if you put the iPlayer or Netflix or Amazon Prime on or whatever, you're going to choose something to watch. And the thing that you choose to watch will generally tend to be something that you'll expect to enjoy, right? That you'll expect to engage with. So the AI scores, despite the fact that television viewing is fracturing as a whole and more people are choosing to watch later and later after broadcast, as Stephen Moffat put it, broadcast is basically a publication and you can watch any time after that. More people are choosing to watch after that, but the AI scores are still taken only from viewers who watch on the night. So ever since about, 2014, when smart TVs began to be ubiquitous, when people started to watch YouTube and Netflix and the iPlayer more and more because you can access it from your television rather than on a computer screen, and most people wouldn't necessarily want to watch television from a computer screen, the AIs have been going down. And I don't think that's a reflection necessarily. Obviously, there are all sorts of factors in play. I don't think that's necessarily an indication that audiences are on the whole enjoying Doctor Who less. Just that audiences on the night are less engaged with Doctor Who than audiences overall might necessarily be. So I just wanted to get that sort of have a quick chat about that before we get stuck into the episode. Either of you got anything you want to add to what I just said, or shall we talk about War of the Sontarans? I'm guessing that's it. Nobody's got anything to add.
I mean, it does feel that ratings, because of the shift, ratings are getting less and less important. So other things must be taken into account for the continuation of the series. So foreign deals abroad, employment, how high profile it is on social media and the press, its general regard, legacy.
Yes, there's a company now that puts together information about television programs that sort of combines their social media presence with a sort of overall presence among people who fill in surveys against viewing figures, against all these kind of things. And Doctor Who is in the very higher echelons of audience engagement in the United Kingdom. So yeah, I think they're in the all but the top 2% or something very high. I can't remember exactly quite what it was, but yeah, the Halloween Apocalypse charted ninth for the week and got an overall viewing figure of 5.69 million, which is for these days very healthy. And of course, we know that Doctor Who's future's secure because we know Russell T Davies is coming back. So the audience, the chart, the viewing figures, and that. These days, it's more of a curiosity than it is anything to necessarily worry about.
Or a measure of consistency. So you can measure it against itself. So we'll know if the story's been successful in holding people, because that figure will remain roughly the same. Where that figure is, it doesn't matter if it's 3 million or 6 million. If it's 10 or plus million, then that's clearly like line of duty sort of astronomical success. But so long as it's sort of flat through the series.
Well, obviously it's dropped from the first episode because first episodes always get higher figures than the rest of the series. What will be interesting now is, does this figure drop again, or does it drop and maybe rise towards the end? And on that note, before we talk about the episode, one thing, a lot of the programs that do tend to hold their audiences are crime things. Doctor Who, obviously, by its nature, is not a crime thing. You know that I had a theory that Chris Chibnall was trying to emulate Death in Paradise in that first series with Jodie Whittaker back in 2018. But watching this, as much as we as fans might or might not be engaged with it, and as much as, you know, other people who like the same sorts of things as we do might or might not be engaged with it, I did look at it in this second episode and think, is the general audience going to really care about some of these things? Because it's not like a police detective in Oxford or somewhere solving murders. All things that you can sort of empathize with, identify with, engage with. This is science fiction. This is about, you know, a universe ending event, alien creatures of a species that we can't even identify on a planet that we've never heard of. Our audience is going to care. So as good as this might or might not be, I wonder if wider audiences are really going to engage with it in the same way we do. As you say, we'll just have to watch and see what happens across the course of the series, I suppose. Matt, in a nutshell, did you enjoy it?
Yeah, it was good.
Simon, in a nutshell, did you enjoy it?
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, and yes, I've got to say, all the things that I like about various different genres of science fiction seem to come together in this episode, some of them at least. And so this was kind of a more engaging episode for me than the usual. So yeah, I enjoyed it more. With my big caveat, and this week, because I've watched Halloween Apocalypse again this week, and I've watched this one twice this week because we're recording later in the week because of my work schedule. And I did come to a conclusion about what it is that's sort of disengaging me slightly from this series. So shall we get this out of the way and then get dug into the various elements? It's this. I jotted down an example from very near the end of the episode. There's a bit where they're in the Temple of Atropos, and Jodie Whittaker's doctor is just discovered that Yaz and her new friend Vinda have been put there in place of the Mori. And Jodie Whittaker turns around and says to Swarm, "What have you done to them?" And that's all very well that she says it like that, but she doesn't say, "What have you done to them?" She says, "What have you done to them?" And it's kind of, it's not like it's wooden acting, but it's acting without emphasis. And the thing about emphasis is part of the character's understanding of what's going on around them. And this was one of my big bugbears with the Peter Davison era. I think this era, this Chris Chibnall era, more and more reminds me of the Peter Davison era as anything else. And again, part of that was that it got suddenly better in its third series. So I'm wondering, hopefully, if that's going to be the case here too. But the thing is, do you remember Peter Davison? He said often that he would run into a room and run out of a room, and he spends his whole time in the room out of breath because he can't remember what went before and he can't remember what comes afterwards. So he figures if he plays everything on exactly the same level of hypertension, then he can never be out of character going from one scene to the next when the scene that he's going into is being filmed at an entirely different time from the one that he's just coming out of. And I think that's my issue here. When Jodie Whittaker says, "What have you done to them?" rather than "What have you done to them?" I'm just thinking she's playing that line as if she doesn't know who she's engaging with or why she's engaging with them. And I think that's true all the way through. Almost all the lines are played almost entirely without emphasis, so that it's almost as if the characters never know quite who they're talking to or quite what they're referring to in the sentence. And I don't think it's overly notable, but I do think it's a thing and it's there throughout. And that when you notice it, you can hardly avoid keeping noticing it, because I do think it plays as it, and it's really down to the directors. I think it's down to the directors to let the actors know what scene they've come out of, what scene they're going into, where in the story and where in the relationships between the characters and the other characters around them this scene that they're recording right now is taking place. And if that's not happening, then it almost feels as if the entire episode is taking place in lots of little bubbles that don't really relate to each other and engage with each other. And I think my slight issue that I have with this last 3 years of Doctor Who is that it feels as if all these scenes are taking place independently of each other rather than coming in and out of each other as a natural flowing organic thing. But anyway, all right, what did we think of? And there's lots to talk about, so let's talk about these. There's sort of basically 3 different areas to talk about, aren't there? There's where Yaz went, there's where Dan went, and there's where the Doctor went. Before we talk about where they went, Simon, what do you think of the fact that they were split up like that?
I thought it worked quite well, actually. Yeah, as simple as that, really. I thought each independent role was given as much to deal with as each of the others, and the fact that they managed to get back into communication, I thought it gave the story breadth, because it meant we had 3 locations running concurrently, and it made it interesting, because this is a fairly linear story. I don't think it's going to take a huge amount of analysis, because I think it was fairly straightforward with what a lot of the stuff that was going on. It didn't really throw any real surprises in. I think that may be yet to come. So as a Doctor Who episode, I don't think it was particularly groundbreaking. I think the scale of it was something quite new, and I think it came across as quite comfortable with that scale as well, which is great, because all too often Doctor Who in the past and in the last few years proposes to have this massive scale, but doesn't necessarily live up to it. And I think this seemed quite comfortable with what was going on. The end of the universe and the idea of time being messed around with, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I thought it will work really well. So yeah, as far as your original question, yes, I thought it divided up their attention really quite nicely, I thought.
By you, Matt, were you surprised? Because I've got to say I was fairly surprised when Dan and Yaz were taken out of that Crimean part of the story so early and were sent to other places. Was that a surprise? And did you think it worked the way they did it?
Well, was I surprised? Yeah, I kind of expected to see Dan more in the Crimea, because it was being framed as they were starting to develop his reactions to being in the past, and they didn't quite get to the traditional "oh my god, I've time traveled" moment before they kind of whisk him back home to the present. I thought it was quite well done the way they did it. It was quite neatly done. So I enjoyed that. But I guess your point about, so going back to your point about that kind of breathless, not quite knowing what's going on acting, in this episode, it absolutely works because that's the whole point. The Doctor doesn't know what's going on. So this is part 2 of a story where she doesn't know who everybody is. She doesn't know what's going on. She's on the back foot, and she's going to be like this for a few more episodes, and then hopefully she'll take control. I agree that one of the issues with this Doctor is she's been a little bit too reactive rather than proactive, and when she has taken the front foot, it hasn't seemed like that. She's allowed somebody else to commit suicide on her behalf, or she's kind of let her companions fix something while she's in the background. And I'm hoping this time, because it's her last full season, they'll make the climax of this overall story something that she proactively does, something she proactively fixes. But in this episode, I'm enjoying seeing her being on the back foot. Nobody knows what's going on. It is fractured. You say it sort of makes you feel like the scenes are happening in isolation and there's no connection between them. That's exactly what is happening. That's the whole point.
Yes, that's what I was talking about. That's not what I was talking about, though. I was talking about the actual physical direction of the episode.
Yeah, but I think that actually works in this context. I think that supports what the episode's trying to do. You feel like you jump from the Crimea to Liverpool to this weird corridory place, and you do feel like you've been sort of ripped out of these time zones and plonked into a different story. And that's part of the mystery. This is a kind of a crime mystery, but told in a kind of on a different plane. And with the mystery being what is this place? Who are these people? What's going on? To which extent I quite liked when the Victorian guy turned up in the corridor. So there are little. I think Simon's right. This was the main story. The A story was told very linearly, and the B story was told very, very linearly. But the C story, which poor Yaz had been sort of plonked into, and I think she had less to do than Dan and the Doctor, because she was in the corridor part of the story. But that part was the one that was quite subversive, because this corridor was sort of like this weird surreal fantasy place with kind of characters from the other strands kind of appearing and disappearing.
It was basically straight out of season 16, though, wasn't it? It was the Megara from the Stones of Blood.
Yeah, well, that's what people are saying.
It's interesting because that scene felt like a climax. It felt like that was the place that everything was leading to, and yet here we are only in episode 2.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. Next week's episode, as we know, is called Once Upon Time, and now we know that time refers to the name of this planet where the Temple of Atropos sits. And we also know from the trailer at the end that some, if not most, if not all, of next week's episode is going to be taking place on this planet. I think Chris Chibnall is doing that thing that Stephen Moffat did in Series 6. Do you remember in Series 6, you had the mystery of who is River Song? And for the first half of the series, because it was the split season, for the first half of the series, the mystery was who is River Song? And then at the end of that first half of the series, it's revealed. She's Amy Pond's daughter. And then the second half of the series, the mystery was no longer who is River Song, but what takes place in the second half of the series is, consolidating all the factors until all the different factors until everything sits together, in relationship with each other, and you solve the overall story. But the first half of Series 6 was about one thing, and the second half was about something else, and together the two halves of the series added up to a story. Well, that looks to me like might be what's taking place here. So next week looks like a climax to the first half of the series, with something else to develop in the second half after that. So here's a quote from Wikipedia. I don't know who wrote this quote on Wikipedia, and I don't know how accurate this is, because this wasn't quite how I understood the end of this week's episode. But let me read this out to you and tell me whether you think this is what happened. It says, in its plot description of the episode, and it ends with this: the death of the Mori gatekeepers and ruin of the temple has resulted in the Flux phenomenon, it should say, really. And now, seeking to control time for himself, Swarm has imprisoned Yaz and Vinder as replacement bodies for the Mori. Now, I'm not really arguing with the second half of that, he obviously has imprisoned Yaz and Vinder as replacement bodies for the Mori. I'm not entirely sure that the reason he gave for that his the thing that he wanted to achieve by doing that was to control time for himself. Obviously, there was an element of that, but I'm not entirely sure that that was the end he gave as a reason for it. And I'm entirely not sure that the death of the Mori gatekeepers and the ruin of the temple is what caused the flux, as it says here. Or am I mistaken? I watched it twice and I didn't get the impression the flux was because of these two Mori. Does anybody say that? Am I misunderstanding or something?
I think it's still left fairly open-ended, isn't it? I mean, whether this person on Wikipedia's got information of the next episode, has got some kind of synopsis which makes sense of that. But I would have thought that the Wikipedia entry should reflect the episode in its own right, surely.
There were bits of dialogue that said that these temple people controlled time. They controlled this badness of time, and that the flux is this kind of time unleashed. So
it's throwing time out of whack. It's throwing all these people through time, isn't it? Yaz has been thrown through time, and Dan and the Doctor were obviously thrown through time to the Crimea before Dan was thrown back. So the flux is throwing people around in time.
Yeah.
But there's been no suggestion yet that the reason why the flux is caused is because time is out of whack, so much as that flux is throwing time out of whack.
Well, my instinct when you were talking about next week's episode being a climax, my instinct is that at the moment we're still witnessing the dastardly schemes of Dick Dastardly and Muttley, the Swarm and Azure, and that this is the next stage in their scheme. So the events on time next week are just going to be where it should be. The peak of the series is where they're most triumphant, and that's when they presumably destroy this temple, or something happens to this temple, and that destroys time, and then the SH1T seriously hits the fan after that, even though we're led to understand that the flux has already pretty much caused a universal apocalypse. So I think next week's is likely to be a climax, but it's a climax to the baddies' plan, and then the rest will be how the Doctor goes about surviving it and then undoing it.
Essentially, what you're saying next week is the end of The Sound of Drums, where the Masters won, and then the final 3 episodes are how the Doctor manages to, claw back victory from the jaws of defeat, as it were.
Yeah, I think so. So I don't think the events on time, I don't think they're the answer to the mystery. I think the mystery is who are these people?
Oh yeah.
How do they know the Doctor? They're obviously important to the Doctor in terms of they've encountered her in the past, or they've got some sort of significance. I think those mysteries aren't going to be resolved next week.
I don't know. Yeah.
I think we're more likely just to see, what does this temple actually do? What is the results, and how does Yaz get out of this one? And, and Vinder. Don't forget about Vinder.
Of course.
I really hope there's some ambiguity to this, because I would hate to think that this is some kind of definition of what controls time. I mean, it all felt very Loki, which is obviously a huge coincidence, but it did feel very Loki in what it was possibly proposing. But it may not be that at all. It may just be coincidence that this planet is called time, and it doesn't actually control time in that way. I don't know.
No. I think what we're seeing is Chris Chibnall sort of answering some of the things that happened in the 1980s. So if you remember in Logopolis, you've got the Logopolitans who are essentially holding off entropy by chanting numbers. I think the Mori are essentially a version of that. So I don't think what they do is control time in the sense that you mean, that they're in charge of it. But I think what they are there to do is to stop time from being something that's uncontrolled.
In which case, that is extremely similar to Loki. So,
right, but it's also extremely similar to
Logopolis, if you will.
Yeah. Essentially, they're sort of, I guess, right.
Which I think is an unfortunate coincidence, but
It's either unfortunate or fortunate, because it is quite a good idea.
Oh yeah, it's great.
So the USP in this situation is throw the Doctor in to that situation and see what happens to the Doctor. So it doesn't matter that it's not entirely original. They're both pulling from a similar source.
The interesting thing is where the Time Lords fit into all this, though, isn't there? That they were lording over this thing. Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, and clearly at the end of this series, this whole thing is going to have taken place in sort of a pocket alternative universe, for want of a better phrase, because, Sontarans instead of Russia and all this kind of stuff. Clearly, that's not going to sort of be left defined in our universe and in our understanding of history. So all of this stuff is in a sort of bubble universe that's been caused by the Flux meeting the Lupari ships as the Flux goes across the universe. And at the end of the story, obviously, things will have to be thrown back out. So this entire series basically takes place in this bubble parallel universe. So that's going to have to be the case. What you're saying about the Time Lords, it goes back to what I was saying about Swarm and Azure, and now the Passenger too, about which more in a minute. But Swarm and Azure, Swarm was in a infinity prison, whatever it was I said, an endless prison that was being watched over by the Division. And the Division is the Time Lord Celestial Intervention Agency. It's a Time Lord thing. That prison goes from the dawn of time to the end of time. He breaks out of it. If he hadn't have broken out of it, he would have been there forever, from when things began to when things end. And he would have spent that entire time in prison being watched over by the Time Lords, the Division. So it has to go back to Gallifrey. I don't think you can tell this story without it being something about Gallifrey. I'm wondering if Chris Chibnall is going to, because he's setting some of it on the planet called Time, I wonder if some of what we're going to see is going to be some of how ancient Gallifrey came into being. Not necessarily now, in this portion of the story, but Swarm says to the Doctor, doesn't he, that they fought this fight before. It's a fight that they come back to. This was in the first episode, wasn't it? So this planet called Time, this temple of Atropos, I think this is somewhere that the Doctor's probably been before. I wonder if this is somewhere where we talked about, or did we? I think we talked about the fact that when they did the Timeless Children story, we only saw that as being the origins of regeneration. And we didn't see any origins of time travel or anything like that. I'm wondering if this story could be set in the place where, in the past, in ancient Gallifreyan history, this is where Gallifrey got the secret to time travel from. And to that end, I'm going to suggest, mostly jokingly, but you never know, that the Passenger is going to turn out to be the Timeless Child, and this place, Time, is going to be the other end of the wormhole from where they find the Timeless Child, as we see it in the Timeless Children last series. So the Passenger is going to turn out to be the Doctor. I'm only partly joking when I say that. I'm not sure. The Passenger, Chris Chibnall's written a 6-episode series, right? So lots of people, I've been listening to a few podcasts, including some I don't normally listen to, and they're saying, oh, I wonder if Chris Chibnall could pull all the elements together. It's 6 episodes. He wouldn't have put any of those elements in if he didn't have a plan for them somewhere in those 6 episodes, right? So the Passenger doesn't just turn up and Chris Chibnall says, oh, I wonder why I wrote that in, and then forgets about that character at the end of the series. There's a reason there's a Passenger there. There's a reason it's the third character. There's a reason that character didn't turn up until this point. There's a place that character's come from that we don't know about yet. And there's a thing that character is there to do that we don't know about yet. So the Passenger is going to prove to be important, despite the fact that at the moment that character is very deep in the background, right? It's turned up, it's been mentioned like maybe twice, and we've not learned anything about it. We're not going to go through the next 4 episodes not learning anything about it. So there's something going on there, just as there's something going on with all these other things, like Claire getting zapped by a weeping angel in a time paradox situation, and like Di getting taken off to this house. And incredibly importantly, like the black and white bit from the start of this episode where the Doctor sees Lungbarrow floating in the air in front of her, right? Matt, what have you got to say about that?
I thought it could be Lungbarrow when I saw it. Genuinely.
Well, I'm being funny, but yeah, who knows?
If not Lungbarrow, then something. I mean, the idea of Lungbarrow, taking away the name, is still a really good idea, you know. I mean, it wouldn't have quite the same effect if she saw the barn from Day of the Doctor floating in the air like this. It's more dramatic to see this kind of weird, sort of Escher-ish nightmare house. So yeah, I'm up for it. The black and white stuff would have killed Lee. He would have hated that.
I wonder if the way this story ends is by the Doctor going back to when Swarm and Azure first fought the Doctor in ancient Gallifrey in this floating house called Lungbarrow that was filled with weeping angels. And that's how all these things get started in the first place. Time travel, maybe the Timeless Child, certainly Swarm and Azure. Maybe the division was created as an entity in order to watch over Swarm and Azure, hence Swarm being in this prison, and hence Azure being in this sort of not quite chameleon arched, or yes, chameleon arch situation, much like the Joe Martin Doctor was in Fugitive of the Jadoon. So, although Joe Martin's not come back, that situation came back with Azure last week, didn't it? When she was Anna, is it, before she became Azure? So, yeah, definitely Fugitive of the Jadoon has proven to be important. And I wonder if that is, again, a kind of foreshadowing of the way the story is going to end with the creation of the division at the end of these 6 episodes. I don't know. I'm just sort of batting ideas about left, right, and centre here. What did we think of this sort of corridory place then, this planet time? Because I've got to say that was my least favourite part of the episode, because every time I saw that, I thought, oh, it just looks like a much more expensive version of when Doctor Who didn't have the money to go out on location. It just felt like season 16. It was so Graham Williams. It was untrue, wasn't it?
I quite like the effect of the time temple people, the flickering of them on
the
and
triangle
off.
Things.
No. The where they're empty and then they appear.
Yeah,
it was a good effect, and I quite like the eeriness of it. And I quite like the contrast between those scenes and the Liverpool scenes. So I think I liked all of them. I think this was the least dynamic and the least visually interesting for me, and the least kinetic in terms of plot. But I quite like that, because I think if it had been all Liverpool, if plot A or plot B had been the whole hour, I think you would have lost patience with it, or it would have kind of run out of steam. But because they're moving between these more mysterious corridor scenes, it gives you time to sort of reset and relax a bit, because then you're getting the kind of the deep mystery of the series before going into the what does Dan do next, what's happening in the Crimea, what are the Sontarans doing. So it's those sort of short-term mysteries offset with the longer-term mysteries.
This was the important stuff, wasn't it? Simon, what did you think of this stuff?
It's interesting, actually, you say that, because one of the things I was going to pick up on was how great the effects were in this episode. They were incredible, especially that, looking down on the Sontaran ships. Again, I come back to that, when all the ships got blown up, the chain reaction was just incredibly well done. And it's kind of ironic that had that, again, that word I keep using, scale, and yet this planet time was probably the least impressive part of the program.
Yeah.
It was really odd. It was a very odd, quite ironic thing, which kind of, I suppose, undermined me buying into that idea of it being this incredible planet actually called time. I mean, that idea did take me back to Christmas, the planet Christmas, and I thought, is it that same idea that this planet is it's purely a wordplay thing, and maybe it's not quite as important as we think it is. So we'll have to wait and see.
I think we needed to see some of the surface of the planet in order to sell us on the fact that it is a planet.
Yes.
Because as it stands, it feels to me almost like the guy, is he called Robertson, who built the tunnels? It almost feels like he built the tunnels, and the planet Time is down there in the tunnels, and somehow those tunnels are maybe connected to it through a wormhole. Maybe the planet Time doesn't exist as a physical planet, but actually is this sort of, I don't know, intellectual entity that takes on a physical form. And so these Mori are actually sort of floating around in some kind of intellectual ether, if you see what I mean. I don't know, hard to explain quite what I mean, but you know, it feels almost like it's not really a physical place because we've not seen any.
I mean, I love that idea. I mean, that comes into the Marvel films as well, you know, with the Celestials and characters called Eternity, and where you get these characters, these figures who embody a particular facet of the universe, a particular idea. And I really like that idea. I mean, that again, that comes back to some of the comic strips. I remember this old British Star Wars comic strip that was in the back pages of Star Wars comic in the UK, and it was Princess Leia lands on this planet, and you get these characters who are called, I think they're called Eternity and something else, and they just basically play with the physical world, and they play with Princess Leia and the stormtrooper who land on this planet together, and I love that. And I was trying to think of what was the previous episode in the previous series where they went onto that spaceship and there's those two characters who supposedly.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, Chris Chibnall seems very much influenced by the Graham Williams era, because this is very much the Guardians, right?
Yeah.
Not a million miles away from that. I think he's quite heavily influenced by the Graham Williams era, but also because of course that includes Douglas Adams as well, but also by sort of Christopher Bidmead and some of what was happening when Eric Sayward was the script editor. So I don't think it's that he's attempting to sort of repeat any of these things, but I think what Chris Chibnall is doing is saying they had some great ideas. I don't necessarily think they necessarily always did the best things with those ideas. So why not let's take some similar ideas and see what we can do with them instead. And so it feels to me like this is kind of, this is not the right way to phrase it, but it's the Sayward or the Graham Williams era done right. But I don't mean it's done right. But what I mean is it's done differently, and it's done with a 21st century sensibility and 21st century money.
These are thought experiments, aren't they? Sorry.
Yeah. Go on, Matt.
Williamson. He's the
tunnel guy, Williamson. Yeah.
My problem is I don't actually like Swarm or Azure, the look or the feel of them. I think there is a kind of a comic strip feel to them, but it is, for me, it's like a 1980s feel, which people seem to love. I'm aware I'm an outlier on this, but that kind of glam kind of look to them, I don't find them all that sinister. I think his performance is. I quite like seeing a kind of an over-the-top sort of Harrison Chase performance, but this isn't even quite there. It's not. I preferred the villains in Can You Hear Me? I found them to be much more sinister, and I think that Azure and Swarm, for me, need to be more sinister or more mysterious, but they're actually slightly in your face and kind of theatrical. So I
just because it's the colours. The colours seem to undermine the fact that he's the colour of a grape and he's shiny. It feels like an idea that hasn't quite landed for me.
The makeup's really good, but I don't think the design's especially flattering to the characters. And I quite like the performance, but they're so static. All they do is stand there, and I think
there's no denying that they're original, is there? There's no denying, but I just, as I say, I don't think it quite lands as a impactful design. I think is what I'm thinking. I love some of the ideas. I love the crystals coming out of the forehead and things like that as something, but they're kind of a cross between, I don't know, like a talking grape and a blue meanie or something like that. It doesn't quite work.
I think it's the Tim Shaw thing.
That
Tim Shaw for me wasn't was fine as a one episode kind of disposable villain, and the teeth were a nice idea, but to see him as like being a season wide bad guy who comes back in the end and turns out to be like the big villain of the season, he just felt underwhelming. And I think these guys, and this is only 2 episodes into 6 episodes, so they might suddenly like do something dramatically evil and charismatic, but at the moment they feel more like Tim Shaw than like, I don't know, the master possibly.
I think this is the thing. If they really are the menace that they are pertain to be, I don't think they look it. I don't want to think about one of the greatest enemies the Doctor's ever faced looking like them. It's probably quite petty, but I just don't think it lands in the way that it is intended to.
If this is somebody who's meant to have been in this infinity prison, then this character should be the most evil character that anybody's ever seen. In fact, the new Doctor Who magazine came out today, and there's an interview with, I can't remember the actor's name, but she plays Azure, and and I didn't get to read it because I haven't had a chance, but there is a box out where they just throw a quote from the interview, and it says something along the lines of, I'm not sure they're evil so much as misunderstood. And that's quite appropriate, because I suppose characters who have that amount of power would have different criteria for the way they act and behave than we do. Similarly with the Guardians or the Eternals, for example. So the Eternals weren't evil, but they just had a different morality to us. And of course, that morality is not something that the Doctor is, happy to go along with. Same could be the case for Swarm and Azure, but they are being played as villains as things stand.
Rashenda Sandal.
Exactly. There you go. They are being played as villains as things stand. And, I'm not sure that is necessary. Well, we've got 4 weeks to go, so we can't say. I'm not sure that the way they're being directed is necessarily going to fit with what their overall story is in the end.
There's a lack of nuance, isn't there? Because they're being played as being malevolent with very little grey area at all.
Yeah.
There's a Marvel parallel, because I think they're intended to be sort of Thanos-y, particularly with him clicking his fingers at the end, or almost clicking his fingers at the end of the last episode. So they're intended to be this kind of Thanos with this sort of, as JR was saying, this different perspective of morality and this different view of the universe. But actually they're coming across a bit like Christopher Eccleston as a dark elf, a sort of a character you can't quite imagine is going to come back. But maybe they'll become more Thanos-y as the series goes on.
Yeah, we'll just have to wait and see, I guess. Okay.
They're behaving like they're enjoying it, which is, I think, is there's a vindictive quality to them, which, okay, they've been released from prison. Maybe that's what they're playing on. But it's only episode 2, isn't it? Let's wait and see.
It feels like revenge. And in fact, they've almost said it's revenge. They've not said those words, but he has said, we rejoin the battle, you and I, Doctor. So there's definitely if she's good, he's bad. There's definitely that dichotomy between them. We'll just have to wait and see. Okay, here's one thing. And a couple of people on the podcast that I've heard earlier in the week have said, how does he know where to find Dan? Carvanista comes back and say, when Dan's in that Sontaran spaceship and the Sontarans come in, I'm thinking, how the hell is he going to get out of this? Carvanista turns up. Of course he does. How does Carvanista know where Dan is? Because of course Carvanista knows where Dan is, because he came halfway across space to get him in the first place, and he went exactly to his exact house. Carvanista always knows where Dan is because they're pair bonded, and it's his job to know exactly where he is. So the logic of Carvanista finding Dan when he's in trouble from the Sontarans and saving him from that situation is absolutely fine and perfect. And I thought it was fantastic to see him back. But the reason I bring Carvanista up is because, of course, I got his accent wrong, didn't I, last week? And this has been pointed out. He's a Yorkshire Terrier, so of course he's got a Yorkshire accent. And last week, because one of the things he said was that he pair bonded with Dan, my assumption was that he was supposed to have a West of the Pennines accent, and I spent the entire episode trying to figure out what it was. And of course, it's not a west of the Pennines accent, it's an east of the Pennines accent. And that's why I couldn't work out where west of the Pennines it was supposed to come from, because actually it's my home accent. It's just being given through the mouth of a dog. It's not all that recognizable. So, yeah, that was a mistake, but he's definitely from Yorkshire, and that explains the accent and makes me love the character even more. But what did you think of Liverpool, of seeing Dan's mum and dad, of those wonderful shots of the spaceships on the docks, which were straight out of Invasion of the Body Snatchers? Like I said, I absolutely adored all that stuff on Liverpool. I thought it was by turns hilarious and really evocative of a kind of invasion in the way that Rise of the Cybermen. Do you remember the second episode of Rise of the Cybermen, Age of Steel, where you've got Cybermen stomping around Cardiff? And it never quite convinced you that they were actually in charge. Whereas here, I thought they did it so much better. I suppose that's modern cameras and just production. They seem to have a lot more money this year. What did either of you think? Matt, what did you think of all the Liverpool stuff?
Yeah, I really liked it. Well, I really like John Bishop. I think he's very good. I do think he's better than Brad. I'm finding him more convincing than Bradley Walsh. I think he's delivering the jokes, apart from the wok joke, which did take me out of the. Not
very supposed to, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one part of the episode that I know it's supposed to be a bad joke, but he didn't get any sort of, because he was on his own. He didn't have anybody to tell him that it was a bad joke, and he didn't react like it was a bad joke. He just carried on. So I think that was my problem with it. It's not a major problem. You can get beyond sort of bad one-liners, but apart from that, I think John Bishop delivered everything really well. Yeah, and the Liverpool stuff, as Simon said, the effects were really good. And Liverpool works as a kind of a background for this sort of alien invasion. I think it really, I don't know Liverpool very well, but it's a lovely city, and it's very cinematic. And obviously, if aliens invade any city in the country, I mean, the Great Liverpool would be the city that they would choose because it's such a fantastic place.
I expect most of it's probably Cardiff anyway, isn't it? Or a lot of it. Some of the back streets, at least. What about Simon? What about you?
Yeah, his mum and dad were great, weren't they? As well. And
I really enjoyed that scene. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you've got the if anyone's going to face up to the Sontarans, it's the Liverpudlians. They have that spirit that they will go around attacking the Sontarans, with woks and saucepans.
Hardy folk like they are, the good old Liverpudlians.
Well, yeah, but that's kind of, their sense of humour and that they I'm not saying they're all like that, but there's a certain.
I think the fact that Chibnall's from Liverpool means he can get away with
absolutely
with this kind of depiction of Liverpool, the sort of the in jokes and the slight digs.
Yes, this bears repeating because a lot of people, this seems to have gone completely over their heads. But yeah, this bears repeating. Chris Chibnall is from Liverpool and went to university in Sheffield. And that's how he knows about Sheffield and about Liverpool, because he has spent a fair amount of time in both of those places. So yeah, that I think does bear repeating, because I do think that a lot of people have kind of missed out on that and don't seem to appreciate that's why this is set in Liverpool.
You've got to remember the Tories never get a foothold in Liverpool, so it's got to be a great place, surely.
All right, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the Crimean War bits. The bit with the map where it suddenly turns out that you've got Sontar instead of Russia and China. It was a bit laboured the way they got there, but when they made the reveal, I thought that was fantastic. Mary Seacole, what did we think of her? Because it was... I don't know, it might have seemed slightly odd that you had an historical character, especially one, I guess, of the sort of kind that Chris Chibnall likes to include in his episodes. Not that he's pressing any woke buttons or anything, but then to have her in this science fiction story and to kind of sideline that, I think some people found a slightly odd choice. For me, I think it worked because you got plenty of education about who Mary Seacole was and what was important to her. But you did it in a way where that wasn't the emphasis of the episode. So it was like they snuck that sort of educational bit in under the radar, as it were. Is
I
that a
didn't
nice?
see it. I didn't see it as any different from Charles Dickens. His
Quite, yeah,
his
yeah.
part when he was in, So what I loved about it is I'm aware because I work at a school that the children have been learning about Mary Seacole, so the timing is impeccable.
Oh
It's
wow.
obviously part of the syllabus, so I think that's really great, and of course that harkens back to the Hartnell era with this idea of history being taught. If it just gets one child looking on Wikipedia as to Mary Seacole was, then surely that's job done.
Yeah, yeah,
And she wasn't played in a way that I think was at all disrespectful to the real person. So and she was played brilliantly. I thought she was a really strong character.
Oh, I'll come back to you in a second, Matt. Well, no, I'm coming to you now. I'm going to ask you about Mary Seacole in a second, but this has just suddenly popped into my head, and I wish it had popped into my head earlier because I could have looked it up. But that fight between the Sontarans and the humans, that was the charge of the Light Brigade, wasn't it? That's the Crimean War, isn't it? Or am I completely misremembering?
Yeah,
Because he
that's
does
'cause
say he's from
she,
the Light Division, and that
yeah.
battle is the charge of the Light Brigade. It's just that nobody actually says it on screen.
And she quotes from the poem at the end.
Does she? There
Yes.
you go. Yeah. But nobody actually says it on screen. So there you go. That's even more education snuck in under the radar, I guess. So yeah, we got to see Doctor Who version of the Charge of the Light Brigade with Sontarans. Matt, what did you think of Mary Seacole?
Yeah, I thought she was given just enough to do what they wanted to do with the episode with her, and she had a positive effect. So Dickens in The Unquiet Dead, he was more of a sort of a thorn in the Doctor's side for most of it, whereas Mary Seacole, it was her qualities that actually revealed where the Sontarans were. It was her compassion for the Sontarans to start with that sort of set the ball rolling for the whole plot of that. And there's also the contrast of her listening to the Doctor and paying attention to the Doctor, and the General Logan who isn't listening or paying attention. It's the contrast between those two characters that really kind of highlights her qualities, I think. So yeah, I thought that was really good. I didn't know about her because I went to school in the 1980s and we were still just about taught the great men of history, the Hartnell history, rather than the history they're taught these days. And because I don't know that much about the 19th century, being a medievalist. So it was interesting to me to find out about that side of the Crimean War. But yeah, I thought it was fine.
I liked that bit with the well, I've got one patient who happens to be a Sontaran because I look after people from both sides. I thought that was a fantastic way of sort of getting the story rolling, as it were. The sort of the bit at the end where you've got 7 minutes to blow up, well, not to blow up, to disable the Sontarans, and I didn't find any issues with that. About the Sontarans all taking their break, as it were, at the same time as well. I kind of felt the logic of that was the Sontarans are so arrogant, they just kind of assume that their safe space behind this barrier that they put up is impregnable, and who would dare come anywhere near those spaceships anyway? So yeah, it felt entirely. I mean, it was slightly implausible it's that kind of thing that you've got to have in a Doctor Who story to sort of finish the plot off kind of a way, but it didn't feel ridiculously implausible. It felt on the boundaries.
It's no different to sneaking into the vampire's lair during the day, is it? Because they come out at night.
It's essentially that version of that.
But it's also the Sontarans' weakness is that their strengths is that they're a cloned race. So there's an endless amount of Sontarans. Their weakness is they're a cloned race, so they don't have individuality. They've all got the same kind of personalities, barring a few sort of offshoots. And so they all do exactly the same thing. They all follow orders. They'll all do the same thing at the same time, because as you say, they are a comedic race of monsters, and I'm glad that they're still comedic. I'm glad that they didn't get rid of the comedy. The line about he went back in time for this reason, and because he wanted to ride a horse. Now that worked as comedy for me. The Wok joke didn't, but that joke was a good joke, and
it's quite nice. It's kind of that whole Blade Runner thing of not wanting to be human, but this because they come from a cloned background, there must be this kind of fascination with individuality. So I like that. I can buy into that.
And it was always it's always been a comedic difficulty in understanding individuality. So it's when Strax is talking to Jenna Louise Coleman and calling her boy and thinking her hair is a hat and asking if she'd like to take her clothes off and stuff like that. There's that kind of complete cluelessness as to what individuality is.
Yeah, and I loved it. I thought they were fantastic. I loved the humor, and I loved the balance between the humor and them going around and finishing off injured people and shooting people down in cold blood in Liverpool. So you had the balance between the ridiculousness of the Sontarans and, you know, the danger, the sort of threat and peril of the Sontarans. I thought they found that balance really nicely here, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. We're coming up to an hour, so I suppose we should start to wind up a bit. Maybe we don't want to outstay our welcome. We don't want to go on longer than the hour that the episode took. But speaking of the hour that the episode took, I wonder, because this is 10 minutes longer than a normal episode, and this has got a sort of self-contained story about the Sontarans, one that's left open-ended enough for them to come back later in the series. But it's sort of a self-contained story about Sontarans at the same time as it has all these other things going on. And the self-contained story about the Sontarans is kind of two of the three elements here. So it's the Crimea and it's Liverpool. But the story that's taking place on the planet Time is kind of separate to that, but intertwined. I wonder if watching this, we're sort of getting an indication of what the series might have been if it hadn't have been curtailed to 6 episodes. So the Sontaran story might have been an entirely standalone story. And if you took out the stuff that's taking place on the planet Time and leave Yaz with Dan, say, in Liverpool, or else in the Crimea with the Doctor, you kind of wouldn't have had to do too much to this story to make it self-contained. So I just wonder if this episode might be one of the better examples of the bending of the series that Chris Chibnall's done to turn what was going to be an arc story that threaded through a series of standalone episodes into a series of episodes that actually fit together like a jigsaw puzzle.
I guess you flipped the climax round. So you'd explain that the Sontarans took over the Earth after the Crimean War, showed the Crimean stuff, showed the Liverpool stuff potentially in one episode, but have the time ships wiping out the fleet and changing the future in the Crimea rather than in Liverpool, reset it and then move on to the next episode potentially. So then you wouldn't need the Flux or anything to kind of hang over it.
Exactly. It wouldn't have taken a massive amount to sort of do that, would it?
No.
So this episode could happily have sort of happened in the series. As it is, the fact that you've got that stuff on the planet Time happening in the episode as well, and the way you've split the 3 companions up, he's not done a massive amount to the episode to make it part of a 6-episode story, but it seems to have fit really naturally, and it feels like a sort of kind of organic part of that ongoing story. So actually, I think he's done a really great job of making the joins invisible when it seems to me, I don't know, fairly obvious. Maybe I'm misjudging it, but it seems fairly obvious that some of these episodes probably would have happened anyway in the series before it became Flux. So I wonder if the same will be true of the Angels one in a couple of weeks' time. Speaking of things that are coming up, the next week trailer. So it looks like you've got Cybermen invading this planet Time. I wonder, therefore, and I'm not going to try and guess too much about next time, I wonder if the Cybermen might not have especially a big part in next week's episode. I wonder if maybe that'll be just 1 or 2 scenes. I could be completely wrong. But some of the other characters who seem to be turning up on this planet, I wonder if something's happening in time, in the planet Time, that's causing things from the outside to be drawn to it. And so, like the Cybermen or these, it looks like you've got characters from history, from Earth history, turning up there too. I wonder if all these things are being drawn to time because of some problem that's happening with these Maori characters. So maybe the Maori have gone wrong, And so maybe we're going to get some kind of resolution to some of the time aspect of what's going on. I don't know. What did you think of the next week trailer, Simon? Did you like the fact that you've got Cybermen, maybe?
Yeah, I didn't take it in too much. It's I've seen criticisms on I think on Twitter with some people saying that these episodes are maybe too fragmented and chaotic, and therefore they don't make sense. And I haven't had that feeling at all. They feel fragmented for the right reasons, which is that these are all plots that are all going to thread together. So these trailers are so all over the place, throwing imagery at you, that I don't think there's any telling at all as to what proportion of what thing is going to be in there. So I didn't really take it in. Yeah, I saw the Cybermen, and they look great. And I think, when I come to give my final thoughts on this episode, I'll come back to where I think this kind of all sits, because I don't think overthinking these episodes will do them justice. Certainly not in my head, anyway.
Well, Matt, have you anything to add about the trailer then?
Well, should we? Only if you aren't able to hold 5 or 6 plot threads together in your head and follow them, then you better not watch something like Game of Thrones, because you'd basically just lose it.
Well, this is definitely more in the Game of Thrones than Death in Paradise, say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not linear, but when is Doctor Who ever linear? And yeah, different things are happening in the episode involving different characters and different sort of plot lines.
That's a story.
That's called fiction. That's like how stories work. When it's not Ulysses. You're not just inside one person's head for an entire. Anyway,
I'll tell you one thing before you go on. Just on that point, is that this feels to me like Chris Chibnall. Because there's always a comparison to be made. Is Chris Chibnall more Russell T Davies or more Stephen Moffat? And I think generally the idea has been that he's leaned more towards Russell T Davies. But this feels to me like Chris Chibnall is doing Russell T Davies writing a Stephen Moffat plot. So do you know what I mean? It's kind of got the best of both worlds, but the plot seems very much in the Stephen Moffat ballpark. It's not what he'd do or the way he'd do it, but it's in the ballpark. Whereas the characterization and that sort of side of it is very much more towards Russell T Davies.
Yeah, or it's Chris Chibnall just applying his Broadchurch technique to Doctor Who.
Yeah.
I'm not as big a fan of Broadchurch as many other people, because I never think it's quite as planned through as it appears to be in the end, and that makes me very anxious when watching it. Because it's fine watching lots of plot threads so long as you have the confidence that they've come up with a conclusion that ties them all together from the beginning. If you don't, and if you think they're making it up as they go, or they'll work out the ending sort of on the way, then that creates a sort of an unsettled feeling. I think you have to trust the writer to be able to finish it. And if it finishes in this perfect kind of tying everything up way, then that's great. But as Simon says, we can't overthink it. We have to just watch it to the end. Next week's trailer is overshadowed by the synopsis for the Angels episode.
In your mind,
which sounds
I agree.
Sounds so unbeatable and so kind of not Chibnall proof, but so immune to any kind of getting it wrong. Surely you can't mess up a synopsis like the Angels episode synopsis set in Devon, which is like not the best county in the country, but it's all right.
Not anymore. Now you've moved out.
Not anymore. No, it's not like
it's like me in Cornwall.
The Cotswolds. Yeah. So yeah, next week's looks fine. I agree. I don't think the Cybermen are going to be a big part of it. If it has a sort of a good man goes to war feel potentially to it, of disparate things turning up. But as I'm not at the moment swept away with Swarm and Azure, a Swarm and Azure heavy episode, which this sounds like it's going to be, or feels like it's going to be, feels like something I've got to get past at the moment, but it might turn out to be the best episode of the series. So there we go.
So Matt, sum up and score this episode.
I think the best thing about this episode is it didn't drop the ball from the last episode. It picked up threads from the last episode. it integrated the Sontarans really well. It moved forward. It had energy. I like that kind of sense of chaos and desperation, and the fact that TARDIS is falling apart. So it's a really good part 2. Oh,
and
I've got to score it. What did I score the first episode?
I think it may have been an 8. I'm not sure.
I'll give this one an 8 as well, because it is. I think it's just consistent.
I'm going to give this one an 8 too. This really ticked a lot of my boxes, but at the same time, going back to what I said right at the start about some of the dialogue not feeling like it was delivered by people who knew what they were talking about. Wow. So for me, it didn't quite lift it to the absolute lofty heights. But yeah, this ticked a lot of my boxes, and it's an 8 from me. So Simon, sum up and score.
There was a lot that I really liked about this. I think Chris Chibnall has done a far better job than RTD did at bringing the Sontarans back. I think he depicted them in a way that really makes me want to see them more than the Daleks. If I'm honest, I would be more interested in more Sontaran stories now than Daleks, because they are nasty and they are everything that they were ever kind of in kind of it was inferred what they were like. So I really enjoyed it. I thought the comedy was done well. I didn't mind the wok joke. It was so close to him winking to the camera with that joke. It was unbelievable. And also I think it just seems to be a no holds barred Doctor Who where anything can happen. The whole idea of the doors disappearing off the TARDIS and things like that. All these kind of lovely thought experiments. The only thing, there wasn't, as far as I can tell, there's no twist, which would be the only thing holding me off from a 10. So I didn't have a problem with the dialogue so much this week. I think the pacing is going in line with Jodie's performance now. I think that's kind of all in sync now, which it hasn't been at all up to now. And like Matt, I have reservations about the enemies, but I think I've got to think above that and think what they represent as opposed to what they look like and how they're portrayed. And I think that hopefully that will carry it through. So in a nutshell, I don't think it pays to overthink this. I think it's a wondrous thing when you've got a Doctor Who episode that works as well as this. And I think this is all we can ask from a Doctor Who episode. And therefore I'm going to give it a 9.
9. Okay, next time we're actually going to probably be able to record on Sunday evening because my work schedule's come around to that. So our next episode will be out on video on Sunday evening and on audio on Monday morning. Until then, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.